how are countries and why are they different? Why are cities and neighborhoods distinct? Chicago is one of the most visibly strong and distinctive in its neighborhoods. And they are labeled with abstract names like Hyde Park, but in many others, like Bridgeport, Irish Catholic politics is Bridgeport. These are the top leaders and have been there for a long time, decades. Most of the 20th century. In other parts of the U.S., there were efforts to homogenize and Americanize everybody. Chicago has done the opposite, to maintain a distinctive local culture in many neighborhoods and say this is who we are. The largest single ethnic group in Chicago is what? Polish Catholics. There are lots of Poles in New York. How are the Poles in New York and Chicago different? Yes.
The Poles in New York are mostly Jewish, no? And here they're almost all Roman Catholic.
Big difference. And big differences in the political cultures of those two cities. Many of the political activists have been within the unions. Jews have dominated. The most important Marxist activist group in the United States, well, first the city is New York, and second, the unions are where the Jews were particularly strong. And the strongest of these in terms of Marxism was the ILGWU, the International Lady Garment Workers Union, where my mother worked in the 1930s, and she helped Russian ladies create brassieres, as they were recently created, but they would sing songs about Gilbert and Sullivan and having fun, and then she would add the international, connecting these together. Okay. This was the style of what we had little bits of this from different sources there in that example, but my main point was the union and Marxism was strong, and the linkage between the Jews and New York as well as its sources going back, as Elazar will take us to shortly, several thousands of years. A couple of thousand. We have 50 wards in Chicago. These are large in number. That is, many city councils maybe have 5, 10, 15. So when you have a small number of big wards, then you have many people of different sorts represented by the same representative in the city council. In Chicago, we have the opposite. We try to have initially they were separate ethnic groups represented by distinctive aldermen. However, if you have one group of aldermen and they're fighting against the others, they may want to what's called gerrymander. You redefine the boundaries to weaken your opposition. And so you may weaken one ethnic group by dividing up, say, the Poles or the Italians among 3 different aldermen. Or Little Village is a book on this. Little Village is a strong, heavily Mexican neighborhood, but it's divided among 3 aldermen. And one really represents it coherently and has a lot of money coming down, and it works with the gangs and with neighborhood associations, and they support the aldermen, and crime is low. And the other half, roughly, of Little Village, there are 3 other aldermen, and they don't really care so much about those people there, the Mexicans in that neighborhood, because they're a tiny part of his ward. Okay, so these kinds of things divide up where and how politics links with culture. And so the ways that these events sought to maintain or change this, we've heard about a little bit in the beginning of the course when we talked about Wall Street, Saskia Sassen, for instance, stressing that in that sense, this is the Marxist side. I mean, Saskia Sassen really combines Adam Smith and Marx. Really, it's really Lenin. And so this is the Lenin side of Sassen, which is to focus on the sense that Wall Street and markets of money are really the drivers of globalization. However, I'll mention a book with a great title, Natasha's Dance. It's written by a British historian who's a Russian specialist. And he looks at local culture and variations, culture in 2 senses, the different regional variations within the regions of, let's say, close like the Ukraine, Moscow, Kazan, which had really 3 different subcultures within them. Kazan is I think it's the 3rd largest city in Russia, but it was created not by the Russians. It was created by the people I want to talk about now, because what he does, which is fascinating in this book called Natasha's Dance, is to say, where and why do we have these tough czars, and why do they kill people, and why are Putin and the others with Ukraine right now killing each other so mercilessly in terms of, killing them off, literally. Not to say, or not to forget, we have similar things going on in Israel and Gaza right now. These particular battles, these particular subgroups, go back for many, many centuries. I visited the Museum of the History of Jerusalem, and it was at least in that museum you can see, I think, 3 times where practically all of the residents of Jerusalem were either driven out or killed, and to concompletely rebuild the population of Jerusalem, battling between Syrians, contemporary Iran, etc. These kinds of battles go way back. Have they ever been joined? Yes. Iraq, Russia, Ukraine were all part of one empire. Where and how was this? What kind of globalization was this? Was this Wall Street? No. When and how did this happen? Anybody have any? Yes?
Mongols? The Mongols?
Yes. Want to mention a sentence or 2 more? And yeah, it's see that is, I knew very little about this until about 5 years ago, when I had a teaching assistant who was Chinese, and he was particularly interested in the Mongolian impacts on culture inside China, and then within Russia, and then within other parts of the world. Okay. Anybody have any little bits you want to give us and how many have ever heard of the Mongols? Genghis Khan. How many of you know anything about Genghis Khan? Tell us a sentence or just anything. That is, I'm making the point that most of us know almost nothing about Genghis Khan, but we know about Wall Street. Okay.
Well, Mongol warlord that took over China and then expanded westward towards Europe and took over most of the Central Asian steppe and controlled the Silk Road.
Okay, yes. Yeah, let me add briefly. There was a headline in the news here about a month ago that the Pope visited Mongolia. The first time a Pope had ever visited Mongolia, and he said, the second interesting point was, what did he say to them from the perspective of the Vatican? And what at least was quoted in the press, this was a short news story here, was that the Mongolians were very thoughtful and responsive administrators, and they kept the differences among cultures not just mercilessly attacking each other. They maintained a sense of I won't say calm, but at least they were not fighting. Okay. I'll add one more anecdote, sort of connecting the bigger themes through our course and through the differences in cities around the world today and how they're changing in the last recent decades. Not only the Ukraine and the city of Kiev. The Kiev was the most important city in all of Russia at that time, and it was attacked by the followers, not just Genghis Khan himself, but his family continued for generations. Russia was occupied for about 250 years, and it has left a lot of residue. And when they were so during those 250 years, who would they fight with if they were Russians? This was an open question because there was no national government. There were lots of little dukes and principalities and regions. The Ukrainian variation, Siberia, all these other things were very loosely separated. As in the 1930s, as the Russians and others could see, Hitler was becoming very aggressive and could head toward Russia as well as toward England, of course. What did Stalin do to prepare? He didn't just get tanks or whatever. He commissioned 2 movies, 2 films by the top film director and the top classical musician in Russia. And they made 2 films. And the first was about, basically summarized as the Battle of the Ice. There was a battle where the Germans and the Poles, as part of the Holy Roman Empire, were trying to attack Russia. And the leader of the military leader in that area had his staff around him, and there's a shot in the films as the Mongolian administrator was there. They said, "Why don't we fight these Mongolians?" And his answer was, "The more important people to fight are the Germans." Okay, preparing for Hitler. The director and the point is, how many ever heard that Stalin, 1938, I think 37 was the first film, the other was in 1943, I believe, the height of World War II. Stalin then had the same 2 men in Kazan, the city of Kazan, far away from the German front. And the second film has the name in Russian. It's a different adjective, but it's often translated into English as Ivan the Terrible. Okay, it could be Ivan the Formidable, or Ivan the, a more abstract adjective like Leviathan. Okay.
So sorry. Could I borrow this eraser?
Go ahead,
please?
sure.
Thank you
Go
so
ahead.
much.
Ivan was one of the competing persons trying to integrate and build a nation basically out of these separate regions which were not yet a nation in a broader sense. They had been occupied for 250 years by the Mongolians, and the center, if you will, was Genghis Khan. But in the film, they offer a general, would you like to have a city here? No, I don't want a city here. So they did build a city called Kazan at the other side of Russia. I want to say not too far, it's in the middle. It's a sort of east, closer to Moscow. But the point is, that city is today the most important remaining culturally connected region and city linking to the Mongolians. And Ivan then attacked, and being more brutal than the Mongolians when they had subordinated much of this region from China through Russia, etc. But he became the first czar, and so the czars, the point of the film and the point of Stalin was closely coordinated with them on what they put into the film. We need violence, power, central national control, and I, Stalin, need this now to fight Hitler. And we Russians will be there in the same tradition that for 250 years we overthrew the people who did conquer us, and we will beat down the others, because the Germans and Napoleon never conquered Russia. But Genghis Khan did. So let's see a little bit about Genghis Khan.
A funny story while that's happening.
Sure.
When
the Kherats in the war against the Tatars initiated by the Jin dynasty. Temujin would avenge his father in this conflict. The leaders of the Tatar tribes were executed, while the non-aristocrats were invited to join his ranks. He delegated authority based on skill and loyalty, rather than tribal affiliation or blood. As an incentive, Temujin promised civilians and soldiers a portion of the war spoils. His new rules laid the foundations of a code of law which would eventually be developed and applied to his empire. His father's death influenced Temujin, and one of the laws was that hospitality was sacred. Guests and envoys should not be harmed. Temujin revolutionized the steppe world. Each victory brought more warriors to his side, and he reformed the Mongols into an army. The decimal system was implemented, and the army was divided into tens, hundreds, thousands, and 10,000s. Transfers between the units were forbidden, and if one man deserted, the other 9 in his unit were put to death. Commanders were chosen by their men, except for the commanders of the 10,000s, so-called tumens, who were hand-picked by the Khan himself. This chain of command allowed flexibility, discipline, and loyalty, and was vital to performing sophisticated maneuvers. Every able-bodied man had to be a part of this structure. In 1201, a number of opposing clans called a council, Kurultai, who once again retreated for the winter, this time with even more knowledge about their enemy and siege warfare. In 1213, when the Mongols invaded again, their mobility prevented the Jin from organizing a successful resistance as their countryside was raided. The Mongols began besieging multiple fortresses and cities and waited for the enemy to attempt to break the siege, only to be ambushed and defeated. The Mongols were fighting guerrilla warfare within a foreign land. The cities that surrendered had most of their inhabitants murdered or enslaved. However, engineers, artisans, merchants, doctors, teachers, priests, and administrators were spared and asked to join the Mongol horde. Many others were taken and used as meat shields for the following sieges, marching in the vanguard to block arrows or discourage the archers from firing. After securing all Jin land north of the Yellow River, Genghis moved against the capital of Beijing and besieged it. The Mongols tried to starve the city out, but after a few months, an epidemic spread through their camp, and they had to negotiate with the Jin Emperor Xuanzong. He agreed to peace in exchange for a tribute of loot, men, horses, and his daughter, along with subjugation to the Mongol Khan. Thus, the Mongols left China and returned to Mongolia with their treasure. But just outside the Great Wall, a messenger galloped to Genghis Khan. The emperor had moved his court to Kaifeng to the south. This enraged the Great Khan, as it signaled that the Jin planned to retaliate. The Mongols quickly returned to Beijing and besieged the city with the help of thousands of Chinese engineers. The city was surrounded, breached, and razed. For weeks, thousands of carts hauled loot back to Mongolia. The fires in the city burned for over a month, while its people were massacred. What was once considered a nuisance had brought a 20 million strong nation to its knees, and now the Mongol devastation was heading west. They started their offensive. The biggest, most prosperous Rus city, Kiev, was besieged in September. The envoys sent in were killed, and the city fell after a 3-month-long siege. All 50,000 locals were massacred. With the Rus principalities belonging to the Golden Horde, the Mongols now looked towards Central Europe. The Venetians delivered on their deal with Subutai and provided him with valuable information on the kingdoms they were facing, which allowed him to plan a devastating campaign against all of Europe. In December of 1240, the Mongols were ready to pounce on Poland and Hungary.
Okay. So they turned south, they conquered what is today Iraq and Iran, and they basically massacred the full populations of both of those capital cities. So these kinds of battles, and that is, the people today, many of the citizens in Iraq, well, and then the populations of the entire countries of Iraq and Iran never regained the population that they had been before Genghis Khan, I think, for something like 400 years. So they were massive changes, and people know this and remember this because of movies like this and history books, which are not part of American high school curriculum. Okay, but these things are, and these are written about. They're novels. They are operas, plays, which Stalin continued with the films on the rise of Ivan the Terrible and the battles with both the East and the West. But also that we the czars and I, Stalin, continuing this, have built upon, and we are using this merciless this when okay. So the Russia, one of the 19th century books of Russian history don't mention Genghis Khan. They tried to wipe this out, and they tried to just include so the mid 20th century. This has brought these back in, and so these have been handled in multiple ways in different time periods. And I'm making these points because the same is happening right now in Europe, Australia, Canada, and the U.S. How to handle the cultures of immigrants in the minds of the immigrants themselves, and how these are variously celebrated, denigrated, ignored, or tried to be erased in different countries, such as France. So the French tradition, I mean, I had a guy who came from me in France. He did called a doctorat d'état. It's roughly over 1,000 pages, and he compared Chicago and Paris in terms of how the experts on immigration had treated them in opposite manner. And in Paris and in the French in general, from the 20th through the 20th century, basically, immigrants they just didn't talk about it. You don't have immigrant neighborhoods like Bridgeport or a little village in Paris. They don't celebrate. They just don't know about these things. And the idea is that I worked as a translator advisor in French West Africa. All of the exams for students who would finish the baccalaureate, they finish their exam finishing high school and to go into university. Could those exams be judged and corrected with the same criteria as everywhere in France, or could they be modified or made them? Are their standards different because of what we call here affirmative action or other things like this? What they did was to send the exams to Paris, and so the Africans' exams would be corrected by Parisian readers who had no idea where they came from. So when I worked with them, the university graduates or the university students from Guinea, where I was working, which was the most communist, pro-Chinese, pro-Russian initially country in all of Africa. They were trying to join and these are these issues today? Absolutely. So and the French colonies are among the most difficult and violent and anti-colonialists. They're really fighting with Macron right now. So making a simple point that who defines you and yourself with globalization or nationalization or the region within West Africa or the people who were university graduates versus those who had not. And so the people who were the most proud were university graduates who knew they had gone up and come up within this French universalistic system, and they knew that they were the best. So they had a sense of arrogance, which we'll talk about in other sections. How the French hierarchy, strong state, and a sense of arrogance, which the whole state has maintained for the whole period after the 1789. Macron, the president of France, about 2 years ago, abolished this leading institution which trained the high-level staff members of the national government, the ENA, the National Administration School. And in that way, this example of where and how you can play up or play down cultural roots of different countries, and how France basically, in this sense, and in terms of Chicago, was the opposite of Chicago, which is celebrated in many respects up to today. That is, until very recently, that is, with the beginnings of the immigrants being flown in or trained in from Texas and Florida to come to Chicago, they were initially welcomed by many Chicagoans, many organized groups. And I know very well a student who's the director of the main Korean association in Chicago. He's done that for decades. And he has negotiated with the mayor in Chicago for years with many other black and other ethnic group organizations. And so in Bronzeville, my Bronzeville churches and others who I talk to say, yeah, there's a student of mine working on this, and so I mentioned his name. And said, yes. So he has coordinated ethnicity and helping the organizations be stronger within Chicago, because they're trying to help and continue the cultures of the countries from which they have come. But I'll just add as well, now that almost all the Koreans have come here, built successful jobs, firms, little organizations, they no longer need the kind of help with the kinds of courses in English or other things which they needed when they first came. And basically what the Korean organization is now training Mexicans and African Americans with the same teachers and the kinds of curricula in some of the classrooms which they built up in the past. Illustrating in this way, or just one more example, they would give the Korean merchants in each neighborhood would give to the aldermen large numbers of groceries, which the aldermen would then give to their residents, telling them that they came from Korean groceries. The aldermen got the political credit. So these kinds of things are going on, and these are the little bits and pieces of how globalization can work or change in content, which you can see combined with violence, or instead being very smooth and helpful, like Christmas tree gifts, turkeys, wine at Christmas or Thanksgiving, which Jane Byrne would offer with great celebration, and take credit for doing this across Chicago. Okay, so I'm making these points about how these things are there, and then let me stop for a minute. Any questions on what I've said? Because I'm deliberately going back and forth historically to show you that the roots with Genghis Khan are still there today in the Middle East and in Ukraine and Russia's fighting going on. And do you read about this from the American or Western sources? No. I mean, these are things which are very, or that is, I'll just mention, I have a niece. Somehow she got very interested in the relations between Ukraine and Russia, and she worked for a couple of years writing essays about the cultural differences. And then what you do see sometimes in the Western media is some of the speeches of Putin, and how Putin was changing the historical reference about one or another aspect of Ukraine, and is that really Ukraine, or is it Russian history, or is it a Russian church, or is it a Ukrainian church, and so forth and so forth. So these kinds of issues are these things are very saliently and similarly when the entrepreneur, the political food military entrepreneur named Wagner was marching toward Moscow recently, a year or so ago, when Putin went onto television and he said, please stop, citizens of Russia, be prepared if necessary to fight, because I am being attacked in ways which are, and then he made a reference to that nice Tsar, and the Tsar was being attacked by other people, and so Putin uses would and did now use these kinds of reference, but that is, he chose not the communist background more narrowly of Lenin or Stalin. He celebrated even the Tsars as a positive, emotionally loving example of history, which you should think of, and me, and we must fight off this Wagner type who may depose me. Okay, so these you see how these are fighting issues right now. Okay, any questions on what I've said thus far? Comments? Yes. Yeah.
I just saw today that the foreign minister of Ukraine suggested that the guy who is leading that, they say he died in a plane crash, but there are rumors now, which the Ukrainians say, that he's actually alive. That was a stunt to help both of them save face, and he's in a dacha somewhere in retirement.
Yeah, well, that is within the military. How did Wagner get? Almost to the beginnings of the city of Moscow, the entire Russian army did not stop him. And so, which of these generals and lieutenants or officers and others were supporting Wagner, or at least not defending Putin, is why these people have disappeared often. Okay.
Prigozhin, I think, is his name.
Okay. Yes. Let me as we've got the big readings are Elazar, Lipset, Engelhardt. Let me mention a little bit. I'm going backwards a little bit historically in order just to make the same point again. The normal thing which Americans and in a course like this, I say urban studies, would read about Elazar would be to show a U.S. map. Like this, with the New Englanders, the Middle Atlantic, and the South. And what Elazar stressed were these were three big distinctive types of immigration and types of culture, and that they are fighting today. We are fighting each other within the U.S. and within Orange County. These and then what is right or wrong, what is left or right, and so forth. So the New Englanders basically, just to push further before generalizing, they went to Western Michigan, for instance. The Dutch reformers right across the river, right across the lake from Chicago, have a strong New England moralistic style, and it's right out of Max Weber's Protestants. Which groups of Protestants did Weber stress as distinctive? Calvinists. What's the difference between Calvinists and Lutherans, and, well, let's say, and Catholics? Why are they different? In terms of one or two words, bigger concepts. Catholics are very hierarchical with the Pope at the top. The Lutherans, Martin Luther, said we want to be separate and be independent and not have the Pope. But he did say to the dukes and the counts and the mayors, you can have a veto, or we'll confer with them in appointing the ministers with the churches of the Lutheran denomination. So they were partially dominating through the political system. The Calvinists said, no. The legitimacy is the people. And we Calvinists, with the hand of God, from the bottom up, we will choose our local leaders. And this is a major source today of democracy and the religious sacred foundations of a bottom-up egalitarianism spreading around the world today in ways that that make this very different from the rest. Okay. Some things that Lipset, I'll just say briefly. Lipset, I would say, mistakenly omits or plays way down why and how these specific values are distinctly American. So we're going to get to, so Lipset says there are 5 different values you can find and what really makes America different from the rest of the world. When Elazar goes with Max Weber is to say, what's the content of those values which make America different? And one of the most important is the strength of Calvinism and the strength of even within that, of evangelical religion today, of dominating and expanding rapidly to have the majority of people in this, for centuries, Catholic country of Brazil. The majority of people who go to church on Sunday today in Brazil are evangelical Protestants. And they're very political. They have seats in the National Assembly, and the previous president of Brazil had as his main advisors, or let's say lobbyists and helpers. He was from that background himself, and it was the title was the Union of Evangelicals in Brazil. Okay, so my point is, this has really made the U.S. very different. But here, this is Wall Street, this is markets, this is contracts of the sort that Trump has talked about. The South is the tradition of slavery, the Civil War, hierarchy, and it still continues, as people say within the military. The U.S. military speaks with a Southern accent. There's the sense of the hierarchy, the respect for authority, the concept of when the gangs, black gangs in Chicago, and their members are killing each other based on what they say on social media now. What's the most common word about which there are battles and murders? One word. What did they do? What did they do to each other? What did they say in their gangster rap songs? A 3-letter word, D-I-S. I'm asking because we don't have any black faces here. How many of you know what does D-I-S mean? Okay, yes.
Like a diss, like within their rap. If you're referring to a diss, I guess the way I understand it is usually like they're trying to outshine each other in like a power dynamic, and if they do sort of put someone else down, their life is significantly at risk.
Yes, but that's the long end. What's the simple, short one word that it's a summary of? or it's an abbreviation of DIS. What's it mean as one word in English? Okay, so if nobody has that,
Defame, maybe.
sorry?
Defaming another,
Defaming?
or like kind of to defame someone else. Like I guess the way I understand it, I'm
Defaming.
yes.
Okay, no. Sorry. Okay, now just note, all of you and you watching this, I mean, many of you are not from Chicago, but I mean, you have black gangs in Los Angeles, New York, Miami, and so forth. But the classic, this is the driver which joins the gangs with the military. The U.S. military that speaks with a Southern accent refers to the deeper concept which you find within Southern novels, in the music, and in the raps, in the gangster rap, and it is called disrespecting. If you diss me, I will kill you. And that goes on from generation to generation. You don't just disrespect me. Your grandfather and your great-grandfather disrespected my grandfather, and they've been fighting for generations. And read the greatest novelist, many would say of America, would say William Faulkner, and he focuses on how these senses of honor, respect, recovering, and how these continue. That racism is a stupid simplifying label with the subtleties of where and how these things work are what Faulkner brings into this, in which I, from living in basically my whole adult life, have seen and feel this within Bronzeville, and with the complications of how these kinds of things operate, such as how African Americans still hate the Dailies. That's many of them. Okay, so I'm making the simple point that these three different cultures spread around America in the same way that within Russia, Genghis Khan directly has regional differences between Moscow, Kiev, and Kazan. So these differences persist, and they're important today, and where people, and so I'll just mention this. Yash, I know and respect and ask him questions because he wrote a paper last fall about the sub-regions of Orange County, which is a fascinating, complicated, subtle region. And the old style imagery of the John Wayne Airport and Ronald Reagan was Orange County. And that's one little bit of it, but there are many other things going on and fighting each other out with massive immigrants from Asia who are strong, high-level elites training to go to universities, and the numbers who are at top Ivy League schools in the U.S. and who speak perfect English because they went to high school and sometimes even before that in Orange County, even though their home residence is Beijing. Okay, So the three subcultures are what everybody, quote, the Americans know about. But Elazar wrote 50 books. 25 are about the history of the Jews in different ways, including every election and lots of major aspects of Jewish and Israeli culture and history. The other half are political culture, especially of cities. And so when he was religiously trained in Judaism, but he then got a PhD in political theory at the University of Chicago. His first job was at Urbana, and he wrote a terrific book on this one little state called Illinois. And he studied some cities of Illinois. And over the rest of his career, he did three restudies of these same cities like Joliet and Urbana and regions of Chicago. And writes them as if this were the Bible. It's wonderful stuff. That is, instead of just seeing this as a little bit of land in the middle of nowhere, but the Middle West, he links these to the migrations and to Moses and the Jews being expelled and then taken into Egypt as slaves, where they were for a long time. Then finally they were expelled. Some of them were expelled from Egypt, and Moses then went to the Sermona to meet with God, who agreed upon in a Sermon on the Mount. A covenant was given to the Jews, which Moses carried forth, and then Elazar uses this not just for that little tribe, but for certain subtypes of political systems and political cultures around the world today. And that's what's in this reading. Where does that work? Anybody want to comment on any of that? Is, rather than me trying to summarize, I mean, there are lots of, that is, it looks like history, but they're big concepts. And I'll just mention two most important big ones are the covenant and the frontier. Does anybody want to either talk about those or any of the related, some major events which he links to this, and why these are so important for us as analysts of global local politics can use these to not only use these regions within the U.S., but to take this to Russia, to China, to Argentina, and to analyze it more closely. Any takeaways which you folks have from? Anybody else besides Yasha? Okay, go ahead, Yasha.
So, why me?
Yes, I thought your hand was up.
No, it wasn't.
Okay. One aspect with which you all quote know about the Protestant ethic and Max Weber, transforming social science through the 20th century. What his most important single innovation was the idea of the Protestant ethic, and that's why this has been taught in introductions to social science books all around the world, but especially at the University of Chicago. What about the Protestant ethic was then so distinctive, and why did it make the world different? Okay, Weber himself wasn't sure, and there was descriptive history about Calvinism, but what he did was to try to see where and how does this work around the world. And so he went to and said, why did the Chinese and the Indians not develop faster and further first before the Europeans? That is, they had thousands of years, and they were very creative. I mean, things like firecrackers. They were engineers who were part of this Genghis Khan, etc. That is, and long before Genghis Khan, the food, the elegance of food in China. Compare that to true American, hamburgers. They're true American. What are the names of them? Frankfurters and Hamburgers. Are those true American? Okay, we don't have an American food. We're there immigrants that bring in. Whereas the Chinese food, and we're studying these now within China, where some of the many important markers of neighborhood differences within Chinese cities is restaurants. That is, what do the Chinese most use their they are called, their favorite phones are made in China, but their name is iPhone. They're Apple iPhones. And what do they take to use them to photograph? Food. They go to restaurants together And the most frequent thing which they post are families and couples and groups, friends having restaurants, dinners, and then taking pictures of the food to see how elegant whether the sauce is combined with a new fish and so forth. But they don't just do it in one implicated, but then they have, when we then look at the data for Korea, Japan, China, and the West, and we use things like the Google categories where they have categories of restaurants. They have Chinese, French, Italian restaurants. Chinese is one category. When you go to China, they have about 80 different types of restaurants that are well known as having more hot food, more fish, more beef, more pork, or vegetarian. And these are clear, distinctive food differences which the Chinese are culturally sensitive to, the way the Russians are sensitive to Genghis Khan, that we do not. So I'm making a point now, as we learn more about each other, that is, Americans had, I'd say our, or I'll adapt it one level further. Cliff Kelly was Major Alderman under Harold Washington, and he went to jail for a year, like as he would say. And he came to class many times. I had many PhD students who would, and he helped them get started. He said, if we're going to have a party of the aldermen, he'd say, well, not invited unless indicted. So he spent a year in jail, and it was probably, or at least he claims he was trumped up by Jane Byrne. He didn't do anything wrong, but he went to jail just the same. After being in jail, he was the leading commentator on the African American radio talk show. It was a radio station, AM. It's called AM. And Cliff Kelly also had a sense of humor. He was terrific. So he one of his quick lines, which I'm just getting to here, is to contrast with the Chinese. Soul food. He had a 1-hour session on soul food. He said, if this is all you eat, that's all that will be left of you. Your soul. Okay. So the simple point is, soul food is old, bad English food. And that's American food. It ain't black, it didn't come from Africa. I'm pointing to this, well, because I lived enough in France where the French and the Chinese take food very seriously. The Americans have been frankfurters and hot dogs. Were that for years, and still this is one of the main kinds of definitions globally that makes us famous of hot dogs, hamburgers, and they talk about when they in Russia and in China, KFC. Everybody knows what KFC means in China, and McDonald's. Okay, that's American food. All right, so this is part of culture. The Elazar themes I'm illustrating with specifics. If we just take, instead of asking us about Orange County, where Yasha could tell you in detail, what are the big ways that you should be able to link this to other things in the course within the city of Chicago? Do we have all three of those cultures or not? And where might they be? Where might they be by neighborhoods? Or who might they link with? Institutions, ethnic groups, leaders. Who? I welcomed two people once, two women who were from Scotland and Switzerland, and they were both going to an international conference on Jane Addams. Who's Jane Addams?
Hull House.
Hull House. Excellent. Okay, Jane Addams is from Rockford, Illinois. Not from Chicago. She grew up in Rockford, which is the northern, so the furthest north biggest city in Illinois. And it shares with Wisconsin and New England and the northern branch of some of the suburbs and different, it varies a little bit, but basically it's the northern political culture within Illinois. And it's a New England moralistic political culture and helping the disadvantaged. So she didn't create, but she was an activist, and she was the most politically important activist within Chicago politics as in starting reform. So if Bridgeport has the Irish Catholic machine part of Chicago, this was fought by Jane Addams on the other side, and then a few others who came from Lincoln Park and Hyde Park, who were so-called reformers through the 20th century. We had 2 or 3 aldermen out of 50 who were called reformers, and they were inspired by Jane Addams in the early 20th century and through the 21st century, and I work with who's the guy who's been the chairman of the political science department at UIC, has continued the reform tradition. There's a new book called Mayors of Chicago. Okay, I'm linking you with individual current names, but let's just have, let's see. No, wait. We've got Wednesday as well, so we can go on with Lipset more on Wednesday. So I won't try to go Lipset now. So let me stop here with what I've said. With any comments, observations, questions, challenges. So this is Jane Addams is not important, not just in Rockford, not just for UIC, but Hull House really trained many people who were immigrants to develop not just their own ethnic culture, but to build new kinds of music, plays, theater, and to rise socially and economically and culturally across whatever. I can't give you all kinds of names, but there are many talented Chicagoans who came up through Hull House. The distinctive cultures and subcultures of the gangs, Jane Addams, etc., are important in that they can be linked with ethnic background or race, but they can also be newly created by people who maybe one person who is dissing or who is created, that is, Christian rap was created here in Chicago. So many aspects of house music, jazz. Really, Louis Armstrong, when he developed things initially in New Orleans, he came to Chicago, and this was his base. branches of jazz and then different subtypes of jazz. And these musical subtypes are celebrated in well, I'm pointing specifically because one high school right across the street where I live from, which is where I was cross-country skiing in the last few nights, and it's Dunbar High School. Questions or comments? Tell us somewhat about your town and where any of these things either resonate, or we can try to see where we can clarify how they do work. You have with your red hair. Tell us your name again.
Kevin.
Kevin.
Yeah.
Tell us, or remind us a little more about where you're from. Some of this may sound fit.
I'm from New Haven, Connecticut.
Okay.
Originally, I live in New York now.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know how much it relates to this, but I feel like New Haven is a very it's kind of similar vibe to Hyde Park, or like the atmosphere is very similar in a lot of ways. It's a university town. It's really next to a neighborhood that the university doesn't really support nearly as much as it could. Most of my friends growing up, their parents worked at Yale or like at the hospital. The hospital employs most of the city, and they also own most of the land in the city and don't pay as much taxes on it as they could. It creates an interesting environment where you see people who are, there's like a very distinct difference between people who like work for Yale and live in New Haven and people who do not work for Yale and live in New Haven. And it creates a lot of like disparity in the neighborhoods. Like there's this neighborhood in New Hallville that used to be home to the like Winchester Arms Factory, but since that's gone away, it's become like one of the worst parts of New Haven. There's nothing there. And the Yale professors that used to live there moved towards East Rock and like Westville.
Yeah. Remington,
Yeah.
famous guns that people. Okay. Yes, and it was the largest, I guess, one of the largest after Yale.
Yeah. And then General Electric, they built their head office in New Haven, and then they just never even moved into it. Because
Say that again about General Electric.
so there's this large building in New Haven that was built by General Electric to be their like head office. Like that's where they would like run their corporation out of because they're originally based in Connecticut. But as taxes went up, as soon as they finished building it, they abandoned it completely. Now it's just an empty building that sits there, and they moved to Boston instead. So.
Okay. Great stuff. In the Dahl book, Who Governs, there are bits of history, and the early 19th century was predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The late part of the 19th century, they lost. They were numerically voted out, and we had a variety of white Catholics, led especially by Italians and Irish, who were politically most important. And that pattern you could also find in Boston, in Providence, aspects of New York City as well. Whereas by contrast in Chicago, we have many different, maybe 15 or 20, all significantly important ethnic groups in ways that make the politics locally different. Any more about, so anything else? I'm trying to remember, have we, no, we haven't really read about New Haven using Who Governs at this point. This section is called Culture, and culture was not used in the old Chicago school. I mentioned there were three traditions of New York, Chicago, and LA, urban approaches. And the old Chicago school was the 1920s, and it did not use culture. It used instead Darwin in the sense of animals, that people were not really cultured. They acted like animals and concepts like competition and the origin of the species, competition, innovation, conquest, domination, and the like. These were outside ideas imposed as they were onto animals by the 1920s interpreters. The lead book was called The City by Park and Burgess. And basically what we've developed now is a new Chicago school which bring in culture, and one of the carriers of it were Warner, W. Lloyd Warner, who studied Yankee City, is his 5-volume series as a major city. Okay. Is this time right? Okay. I will end for now, and we'll continue on Wednesday.